Hello everybody and welcome back to the space where we say that I can sleep. This is your weekly reminder to stay cool and hydrated because the summer heat is no joke. I literally just experienced a whole week of triple degree weather, so please stay cool wherever you are, okay? Take good care of yourselves. And as per usual, if you are enjoying these readings or would like for me to continue doing these readings, you can show your support by leaving me likes, leaving me comments, sharing my stuff, and also following me on all of my platforms like Spotify at iKenSleep, YouTube at iKenWin, TikTok at iKenWin, and Instagram at officially.iKenWin. Now let's begin another ascension into heaven officials' blessings. Chapter 37, Land of the Tender, Part 2. Where's your sword? The boy shifted him to his left arm and freed the right to brandish his sword. Shilian peeled back his sleeves and revealed part of his arm. Under the glowing moonlight, his skin was smooth and pale as the softest white jade. That boy's breath suddenly hitched, but Shilian didn't notice. "Stab me," he ordered in a husky voice. The hand that held up the worn sword immediately drooped. "Don't worry, just stab me," Shilian urged him. "Stab deeply. I need to draw an array. There are no other spiritual devices on hand, so we need blood." "Your Highness, please use my blood," the young soldier protested, and he raised his own arm and cut without any hesitation. "No need," Shilian hurriedly replied. "Your blood—" But his words didn't make it in time. A deep gash had already been drawn on the boy's arm, and fresh blood flowed from it. Shilian sighed. Never mind." Shilian's blood was an invaluable holy treasure with the power to sanctify, so how could a mortal's blood compare? But seeing how earnest this little soldier was, he didn't have the heart to tell him that what he'd done was pointless. "Thanks," he said instead, "but we still need some of my blood as a catalyst." Shilian took the sword with trembling hands. It took him a few tries to successfully pierce the middle of his forearm. Vivid, red holy blood streamed down his pale white arm, and he used it to drip 2 curved lines in front of the cave, drawing 2 barriers. It could be said to be a waste of heaven's gift. Shilian also took care to mix in some of the boy's blood. As he completed the array, his dizziness grew stronger. "Let's go in." It was pitch black inside the cave. The boy took out a small flare torch from inside his robes and ignited it. The intense firelight brightened their surroundings. The young soldier's face was hidden behind his bandages that covered him completely, while Shilian's unkempt state was on display for all to see. His cold sweat was sticky. His hair was disheveled. His lips were red and swollen and smeared with blood from when he'd bitten his lip to sanctify his sword earlier. The firelight stabbed at Shilian's eyes, hurting them, and the waves of heat pouring off the torch tormented him. "Don't light the fire," Shilian demanded immediately. "Kill it." That boy immediately threw the flare torch on the ground and stepped on it to extinguish it, and they sank into darkness once more. Once they were inside the cave, Shilian sat down and arranged himself into a meditative position. Moments later, he spoke laboriously. "I have a mission for you. Are you up for it?" The boy dropped to the ground and kneeled. "I'm willing to risk my life to do my duty." Shilian painfully restrained his labored breathing and continued with forced calm. "I drew 2 sets of barriers in front of the cave. The outer barrier is to ensure nothing outside enters. The inner barrier is to prevent anyone inside from exiting." He silently panted for a few breaths before he continued. "There's enough space between the 2 barriers for 1 person. Stay there and watch over the cave entrance. No matter what you hear outside, do not leave. And likewise, Do not come in no matter what sounds you hear from me. The boy was slightly perplexed. Your Highness? You're staying here by yourself? Yes, Shilian said. I don't know what I'll do. In any case, do not come in, no matter what happens. Under the circumstances, Shilian couldn't move very far. But as far as waiting for reinforcements, Qirong was probably still stumbling down the road, and just getting back to the imperial capital would take a long while. Who knew when help would come? The only thing he could do was temporarily seal off the small area, set up wards, and figure out a way to treat the tender fragrance. Fruits born of flower. Yao are powerful temptresses, he rasped. They're likely to ripen soon. Then the fragrance in the air suddenly surged, cutting off his words. That beguiling scent filled the air from the earth to the sky, and the flower Yao cackled ecstatically. My root! My root is hard! The fruits have ripened, they trumpeted. Smelling that excessively sweet fragrance, Shilian could feel his heart beating faster, and blood rushed to his brain. He gritted his teeth. Hurry and go! Don't breathe in the scent, and if they come close, don't be scared. Nothing can cross the bloodline, but as long as your feet remain inside the barrier, you can strike them with your sword. That boy glanced outside and gave a hard nod. He rushed out with his sword in hand, stationing himself between the two bloodlines by the entrance. Outside the cave, in that field of corpses, the flowering plants were growing more and more vibrant in color. The briar field was quivering as if something beneath was about to burst from the ground, until, not long later, something did burst forth. The head of a woman. The woman's head that had sprouted breathed in the fresh air above ground and appeared drunk with joy, her eyes squeezing shut into crescent lines. Following immediately after was a round, smooth shoulder, then an entire arm. The fruits of the land of the tender were formed under the whiskers of their roots. They ripened in the shape of feminine forms, and the time was indeed ripe. Countless naked women were breaking out from beneath the earth. They plucked the bright red blossoms from atop their heads and bathed under the moonlight, stretching out their limbs to their heart's content. Those little flowers had emitted the fragrant scent at first, but now the ones secreting that sweet odor were the enchanting women. They patted off the mud that smeared their voluptuous bodies, fixed their hair, and walked around the cave as they giggled alluringly. Your Highness, we're coming. That sweet fragrance was suffocating inside the cave. Shilian sat in the lotus position with his eyes closed, chanting the Tao Te Ching in his head. However, it helped little. The flower Yao called him shamelessly, chirping all sorts of too familiar pet names. Baby, sweetheart, Gaga, Didi. It was throwing his mind into turmoil, so Shilian tried reciting out loud. The five colors cause blindness, the 5 sounds cause deafness, indulgent hunts cause madness, rare goods cause lawlessness, calm over impatience, cold over heat, silence is the ultimate virtue. Be kind to those who are kind, be kind to those who are unkind. Shilian didn't notice that his recitation was incoherent as he stumbled over the scripture he could usually recite flawlessly, backward and forward. Outside the cave, the flower Yao clapped and laughed tauntingly. My dear Crown Prince, my sweetheart, my good Highness, you're not a monk. Why are you reciting sutras? Yeah! Shrieking erupted from all around. It sounded like although the young soldier had been silent all that time, he'd grown furious at the flower Yao and had begun chopping and slashing. madly chasing them away from the entrance as they wailed, "Murderer! You cursed little brat! Destroyer of beauty!" some accused from a distance. "No tenderness in your heart at all. Scary, scary. So brutal at such a young age. Imagine him fully grown." Like starving beasts, the Flower Yao relentlessly tried to squeeze themselves into the cave, but they just couldn't manage it. They didn't notice the blood array on the ground and thought they were being blocked by the boy alone. After some discussion amongst themselves, they gathered not too far away and called to him. "Little Gaga, why must you stop us from going in? It's not like we're going to do anything bad. We just want to have a good time with His Highness." "Be good, little soldier, and don't hinder us from doing His Highness some good too." "That little Didi is so mean. A shame that he's so young and tender. He probably doesn't even know what doing good means." The Flower Yao fell all over themselves in another round of mocking giggles. Shilian cracked his eyes open a slit, but he could see nothing aside from a black shadow standing at the entrance of the cave. It was the shadow of that boy, sword in hand, who was determined not to move, even in death. Suddenly, one of the Flower Yao said, "Hey, little Gaga, don't root yourself there like a stiff shaft. What do you want? Why not come with me over there to have some fun? What sort do you fancy? Am I your type?" The young soldier still didn't respond. Those Flower Yao thought in order to enter the cave, they must go through him. So they all brought forth all their tricks, coddling him with their words. "What about me? How about this? Am I pretty? Look at me. Do you like this?" Starting with flirtation, changing to complaints, and then devolving to curses. Regardless of their tactics, the boys still ignored them while they were far away and struck at them if they drew near. Shilian knew that before the land of the tenders emerged from the ground, they could change their shapes at will. He wanted to warn the boy, but due to his distressing predicament, he didn't dare open his mouth. Finally, when at last those heavy waves of heat passed, he managed to gasp, "Don't look at them!" It was exhausting enough simply fighting the hot blood that rushed to his head, so Shilian's voice was terribly soft and hushed. But that young soldier heard him instantly and called out in response, "Yes, sir! Your Highness, how are you?" "I'm fine," Shilian said. "If things become difficult to bear, shut your eyes, seal your nose and mouth." The young soldier hadn't had a chance to answer when another Flower Yao suddenly burst out laughing. "I know. Little guy, I bet your favorite type must look like this." It sounded as though a new land of the tender had emerged from the soil. A sudden dead silence descended outside the cave. That young soldier seemed to have stopped breathing. In the next second, the crashing waves of laughter from the Flower Yao surged against Shilian, drowning him. The Flower Yao clapped and screeched, "Ay ya, what a play! What a play! My God, how did you come up with this? You slay me." "Look, that brat is completely stunned. I bet you figured him out. This must be it. And here I thought that damned brat was a rock. But who knew how wrong we were? Such balls for somebody so young. You win. We're nothing. How about it, little guy? Come quick and enjoy the sweet, delicious sight. This is your chance. You won't find another shop that serves this dish if you leave this land of ours. If you don't seize this opportunity, you'll never get a taste, even if you dream of it for 800 years. Or do you want us to give you a hand? What a state you're in." The young soldier was thoroughly incensed, and his voice was icy as frost. "You are seeking death. Meanwhile, Shilian was about to reach his limit inside the cave. His sight blurred and his ears pounded with rushing blood. He could no longer sit up straight. He collapsed forward and barely managed to keep himself off the ground with his hands. Taking that tumble loosened his gritted teeth. And in that moment of delirium, a pained, wretched moan escaped his lips. Shilian swiftly covered his mouth the moment the sound leaked, but the young soldier still whipped around. "Your Highness?" Supporting himself with one hand, Shilian used the other to cover his mouth. His breathing was labored and erratic, and his shoulders convulsed and trembled. Seeing him, listening to him, one would probably assume he was weeping. Never in his life, before or after Ascension, had Shilian experienced such a grueling ordeal. This was much more arduous than the toughest trial of the Royal Holy Temple. The strength of the arm that supported his weight failed, and his body keeled over to the side. As he lay on the ground, delirious and barely conscious, he saw the boy looking like he wanted to enter. "Don't come in!" Shilian barked. "I said not to come in, no matter what you hear!" That boy stopped in his tracks. Shilian laboriously flipped over onto his back and somehow managed to regulate his breathing despite the waves of heat that pulsed and spread throughout every inch of his body. The flower Yao outside the cave heard him tossing and turning as that intense fire consumed him, and they clapped as they cackled. "My good Highness, why be so hard on yourself? Today you're refusing yourself a good time because you're scared of losing devotees. Tomorrow you'll be scared to do other things because you're scared of losing devotees. Is that any way for a heavenly official to live? You're more like a prisoner, with your hands bound by those who worship you. It's not worth it, being a god like that. You're gonna lose your place in heaven sooner or later, so why not just enjoy yourself now? Things come and go. No need to mind the petty details." Shilian briefly lost his temper and veins faintly bulged in his forehead. "Shut up!" he shouted, enraged. The flower Yao naturally weren't afraid of him right now, and they started teasing the little soldier anew. "Little Dee, don't you agree? Aren't you feeling miserable just standing there?" His body was already miserably drenched in cold sweat. Exceedingly hot and bothered, Shilian violently tore at his robes in search of even a faint breath of cool air. As he tore, he suddenly noticed, had strength returned to his arms? Although that energy didn't last long, leaving just as quickly as it came, he confirmed that the numbness had indeed passed. His vigor was gradually increasing, and yet Shilian's heart sank. The tender fragrance inflicted numbness at first, followed by mania. The numbness had passed, which meant the madness and passion would poison his veins at any moment. Although he'd drawn 2 barriers at the entrance of the cave, the interior one was made specifically to prevent his crazed self from charging out. But once mania seized him, he wasn't sure whether the barrier would really be enough to stop him. This moment of clarity was a rare blessing, and Shilian clung to it with both hands, his mind rapidly poring over ways to handle the situation. Suddenly, a realization occurred to him. The tender fragrance worked fast, and usually all control would be lost the moment one's blood rushed to their brain. So how had he managed to stay afloat until now? Was the only reason really the exceptional steadiness of his mind? With that thought, Shilian drew a long breath and tilted his head. He called out to the boy's silhouette at the cave's entrance, who was still looking indecisive about entering. "You, come in." The young soldier looked like he wanted to dash over to his side immediately, but after a few steps, he seemed to remember Shilian's furious instruction. "Don't come in, no matter what you hear." and he hesitated. Xilian felt terrible for changing his mind so quickly, but he called to him again in misery. "Just come inside now!" The boy stopped hesitating and rushed in. The cave's interior was a long, narrow tunnel, warm and humid. Darkness shrouded the space. One couldn't even see their hand in front of their face. That boy used Xilian's rasping breaths to find where he lay. "Put down your sword. Put it on the ground," Xilian instructed. "Right next to me, not too far." "Yes, sir." The young soldier heeded him and handed over his only defense, placing it where Xilian could easily reach. "Please, help me up," Xilian asked. The boy half knelt next to him and extended both arms to help support Xilian. However, when he reached out, he touched not fabric, but feverish skin. His hands immediately shrank back. Xilian himself felt burned by the boy's hot hands, and only then did he remember he'd torn off his upper robes in his manic state. A man naked from the waist up usually wasn't anything scandalous, though the current circumstances were slightly awkward. But there was no need to highlight their predicament. They just needed to do what they must. The boy seemed to realize it as well, and he didn't wait for Xilian to say anything. He simply reached out again to circle his arms around Xilian's bare shoulders, helping him up, and then immediately letting go. Xilian leaned against the wall of the tunnel, and with his back pressed against the cool rock, he felt some relief. Noticing that the boy had backed a few steps away, he hurriedly said, "Wait, don't leave yet." That young soldier heeded his every word. He halted immediately. "Cut off a lock of my hair," Xilian said. "I need it for something." The boy acknowledged the order and reached out again. But the darkness made him clumsy, and with Xilian's long locks tied cleanly behind his back, his first contact wasn't with the man's hair. Instead, his fingers met the skin of Xilian's chest. Skin that was soft and supple with a light mist of sweat. Xilian was already in torment from that touch when the boy accidentally brushed against something sensitive. It was like a bolt of lightning jolted through his chest. Pleasure spread throughout his whole body, forcing a soft moan from him. The pair in that cave instantly froze. The flower Yao outside the cave were desperately trying to listen in, so how could they miss it? They giggled. "My gosh, what are they doing in there? So embarrassing. I dare not listen." Xilian gritted his teeth at the sound of them mocking his suffering. "You!" Hearing Xilian's fury, the boy immediately dropped his hands, afraid to make any more contact. Obviously, Xilian wasn't furious at him. In his eyes, that little soldier was nothing more than a child. He softened his tone, thinking the boy was probably scared of offending him. "Don't panic. Just keep going," he said. "Don't mind them." Yes, sir," the boy croaked. Still, he was clearly flustered. He felt up everything he shouldn't, and every time he found that he touched the wrong place, his hands shrunk back. In the end, the only way he found Xilian's hair was to trace his hands up that bare chest, sparking unspeakable pleasure and agony in Xilian. Such misery. Xilian longed to smash his head against the tunnel wall and knock himself out for good. Finally, the boy felt his way to Xilian's throbbing Adam's apple and reached behind his neck to grasp a lock of hair. With only a few strands in his grip, he very carefully cut them with the sword. "Your Highness, it's done!" he cried immediately. Another small surge of strength returned to Xilian, and he raised his palm. "Give me your hand." The boy obeyed, and Xilian retrieved the long, thin strands and tied them in a knot on one of his fingers. "Your Highness, what's this?" the boy asked with a quavering voice, baffled. Xilian sighed. The flower Yao's poison is about to enter the second stage. I need to borrow your sword. If anything wants to harm you later, raise this hand and it will protect you. Now leave. A moment passed, and the young soldier returned to the entrance of the cave. The flower Yao grew rowdy again. You're out? Finally? Blocking us outside like that while you went in to have fun yourself? You're not very nice, kiddo. Meanwhile, Shilian could feel more strength surging through his limbs. He inhaled deeply and grabbed the young soldier's worn sword. In his right hand. He composed himself, then raised the sword and made a cut on his left arm. In a flash, it was like the fog had lifted and his senses slowly returned. He knew it. Blood streamed down Shilian's left arm, but it was like he'd finally grasped a lifeline in the midst of this chaos. The fragrance of the land of the tender could aggravate one's temper and arouse deep, slumbering urges. Typically, the stronger the repressed urge, the stronger the rebound after breathing in the fragrance. As for what Shilian had repressed, other than lust, it was the urge to kill. This murderous bloodlust couldn't be directed at nefarious creatures. He had slain many such evils in the past, so he'd never repressed that desire. The target had to be a human or god to inflict a sense of transgression. Before entering the cave, Shilian had cut himself to draw the arrays, and so blood was spilled. It was somewhat effective against the tender fragrance, because injuring himself was also a form of inflicting harm. At the end of the day, lust and murder were both wildly aggressive desires. Shilian had even heard that some considered them to stem from the same origin. Their nature one and the same. Using himself as evidence of this theory, there was indeed an alternative method to pass the current trial. Sure of his own reasoning, Shilian slashed another cut on his left arm without hesitation, and every cut brought more wisps of clarity to his mind. He was too busy rejoicing at this to realize that the tender fragrance was stirring more evil within his body. The instant his bloodlust was satiated, a wave of pleasure crashed over him. That sudden surge coursed through every inch of him from head to toe, effortlessly breaking the defensive walls he had painstakingly built. By the time Shilian had realized it, he was already quietly moaning. If he wasn't alone in the cave, Shilian wouldn't be able to believe that sound came from his throat. He shuddered violently and his eyes grew wide as he thought, "This method should have worked. Why would this happen?" To be continued.